900 kilometers from the South Pole. A drill came up holding roots, not fossils crushed into stone, roots. An intact mat of ancient forest soil threaded with root networks so well preserved that researchers could still see the structure of individual cells under a microscope. Pollen grains, spores, the chemical signature of a warm, wet, temperate rainforest pulled from beneath the seabed off the Pine Island Glacier in one of the coldest and most hostile places on the planet. The core came up in February 2017 when the analysis was published in the journal Nature. In April 2020, the conclusion was blunt. That soil formed inside the Antarctic Circle in a swampy river landscape under a canopy of standing forest with a mean annual temperature of around 12 degrees Celsius. Green, humid, alive, at the bottom of the world. So here is the first thing you need to understand about Antarctica, and almost nobody says it out loud. The ice is not the continent. The ice is a lid. Underneath it, there is land. Mountain ranges the size of the Alps. River valleys, canyons deeper than anything on any other continent. A buried, sealed landscape no human eye has ever seen, mapped only by radar, bouncing off rock through 2 miles of frozen water. That forest grew 90 million years ago, long before anything resembling a human walked anywhere. That is honest, and we will come back to it. But it establishes the fact that drives everything else. Antarctica has not always been white, and the shape of what lies under that lid was drawn, in outline, by people who, according to every history book, could not possibly have seen it. 3 things are ahead of you. A map printed in 1513 showing a coastline nobody surveyed until 1949. A military operation in 1946 that sent nearly 5,000 men south, with 8 months of supplies, and came home in under 2. And a body of water the size of Lake Ontario, sealed under 2.5 miles of ice, opened in 2012, and then quietly dropped. Start with the wall itself. In January 1841, a British naval officer named James Clark Ross pushed south through the pack ice with 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, hunting the magnetic South Pole. What he found instead was a cliff, a vertical face of ice running across the horizon, roughly 50 meters high at the waterline, with no gaps, no inlets, and no end. He followed it for hundreds of kilometers and never found a way through. He compared the idea of sailing through it to sailing through the white cliffs of Dover. That is the ice wall. It is not a conspiracy. It is a real, mapped, photographed feature. The seaward edge of the Ross Ice Shelf, a floating slab roughly the size of France. Ships still stop at it. Most people walk right past what it actually means. A wall is a boundary, and the history of Antarctica is the history of what has been kept on the other side of it. Here is where it gets strange. In 1912, Robert Falcon Scott and his men were dying on the return march from the pole, hauling a sledge across the Beardmore Glacier. And they were hauling something else, 16 kilograms of rock samples. They would not drop them. When the search party found the bodies that November, the rocks were still on the sledge. Inside them were leaf impressions. Glossopteris, a seed fern from a warm, swampy world. Scott's team died, dragging proof that Antarctica had once been forested, at a time when nobody had a framework to accept it. Continental drift would not be taken seriously for another 50 years. That is the pattern in this place. The evidence keeps arriving before anyone is prepared to believe it. Now, strip the ice away and look at the shape of the land itself. In December 2019, a team led by Matthew Morligem at the University of California, Irvine, published a model of Antarctica's bedrock called Bed Machine, built from decades of ice-penetrating radar. The most detailed picture of the buried continent ever assembled. And it found something every previous survey had missed. Under the Denman Glacier in East Antarctica, there is a canyon. Its floor sits about 3,500 meters below sea level, the deepest point of continental land anywhere on Earth, buried under ice. But the overall shape is the detail that should stop you. Remove the ice, and Antarctica is not one continent. It is two. A large, high, ancient landmass in the east, and in the west, a scattered archipelago of islands and deep basins, separated from it by a trench and a mountain chain running thousands of kilometers. Take away the lid, and you have a continent split by a seaway, with a broken chain of islands hanging off one side. Hold that image, a landmass divided in two by a channel of water. Because in 1053-1, a French cartographer named Orance Fine published a world map showing a southern continent, drawn with a mountain range, with rivers running down to the coast, and with the landmass rendered as two lobes divided near the pole. Antarctica was not sighted by any confirmed expedition until 1820, nearly 300 years later. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic. Cartographers of that era routinely drew an imaginary southern land, Terra Australis, purely to balance the globe. That explanation is reasonable. It is also where the real problem starts. Because there is a second map, and it came with a paper trail. In 1929, in the old imperial palace in Istanbul, a historian found a fragment of gazelle skin parchment signed by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis and dated 1015-13. Piri Reis wrote on it that he had compiled it from around 20 older source charts, including maps that had reached him from the age of Alexander. It shows the Atlantic. It shows South America. And along the bottom edge, attached to the South American coast, it shows a landmass with a distinctive series of bays and headlands. In the late 1950s, a professor of the history of science named Charles Hapgood at Keene State College in New Hampshire put his students to work on it. They compared that lower coastline against the subglacial profile of Queen Maud Land, measured by seismic sounding during the Norwegian, British, Swedish Antarctic expedition of 1949, the first time anyone had read the rock surface under that section of the ice sheet. Hapgood thought they matched, so he did something fringe researchers almost never do. He sent it to the United States Air Force and asked them to check. On the 6th of July 1960, he received a written reply from Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, commander of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base. The letter stated that the lower part of the map agreed remarkably with the seismic profile of the ice-capped coast, and that the detail suggested the coastline had been mapped before the ice covered it. That letter is real. It is reproduced in Hapgood's 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and it has never been retracted. An officer whose job was reading reconnaissance imagery said, in writing, that the map appeared to show a coastline now buried under a mile of ice. If you want to know what else was mapped before anyone was supposed to be looking, subscribe, because this channel investigates sealed sites and buried evidence every single week. And Antarctica is the deepest hole of them all. Now, the mainstream answer exists, and it is a strong one. Most cartographic historians argue that the southern coastline is simply South America bent eastward to fit the parchment, a common practice when a chart ran out of skin. That reading explains the map without a single lost civilization. It is probably correct, but it does not explain the Air Force letter, and it does not explain what happened in 1946. That August, the United States Navy launched the largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted by any nation before or since, Operation Highjump, Task Force 68, roughly 4,700 personnel. 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea and a submarine, 33 aircraft, icebreakers, seaplane tenders, and a full combat support structure, with Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, the most famous polar explorer alive, aboard. The stated mission was training, mapping, and establishing a base. It was scheduled to run 6 to 8 months. It ended in late February 1947, after roughly 8 weeks. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a naval task force with an aircraft carrier turned around and went home in a quarter of the planned time. The official reason was severe weather and the loss of aircraft. 3 men died when a PBM Mariner flying boat crashed on Thurston Island. Then, traveling back through South America, Byrd gave an interview to the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio in March 1947. The report quotes him warning that the United States needed to take defensive measures against hostile aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at extraordinary speed. That quote has been recycled and mistranslated for 70 years, and you should treat every dramatic version of it with suspicion. But the newspaper report exists, and the operation before it is fully documented in U.S. Navy records. 12 years later, on the 1st of December 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed in Washington by 12 nations, including both the United States and the Soviet Union, at the coldest point of the Cold War. It made everything below 60 degrees south a demilitarized zone. No weapons testing, no military bases, no enforced territorial claims. In 1959, those two countries could not agree on the shape of a table in Berlin. On Antarctica, they agreed in months. Then, in 1991, the Madrid Protocol added the part everyone forgets. It banned all mineral resource activity across the entire continent. Not restricted. Banned. And built into it is a date. From the year 2048, that ban can be formally reviewed. An entire continent, off limits by unanimous consent, with a clock running. That is the second clue. Now we get to the one nobody has been able to finish. In 1996, a joint Russian and British radar survey confirmed what Soviet scientists had suspected since the 1960s. Beneath the Vostok research station in East Antarctica, under 3,700 meters of ice, there is a lake 250 kilometers long, up to 800 meters deep. Liquid kept from freezing by the pressure above it, and geothermal heat below, sealed off from the atmosphere, most likely, for something on the order of 15 million years. And it is not alone. Radar surveys have since identified more than 400 subglacial lakes across Antarctica, many linked by rivers, that move water beneath the ice in slow, measurable pulses. There is a hydrological system down there. It has currents. It has drainage. On the 5th of February, 2012, after more than 2 decades of drilling, a Russian team broke through into Lake Vostok, the deepest ice borehole ever completed. Here is where it gets strange again. To stop the shaft collapsing under pressure, the drilling used a mixture of kerosene and freon. When lake water surged up and froze, the samples came back contaminated with the very fluid used to reach them. The most anticipated water on Earth was compromised at the moment of contact. Even so, in 2013, the microbiologist Sergei Bulat announced his team had isolated a bacterial sequence that matched nothing in the global genetic databases. Unclassified, unknown. It made headlines worldwide, and within days, the result was walked back and attributed to contamination. Maybe it was contamination. That is the most likely explanation. But notice the pattern. Scott's rocks. The 1960 letter, a task force sailing home 4 months early. Every time an instrument reaches deeper into this continent, it finds something that does not fit, and then the investigation stops, gets defunded, gets contaminated, or gets explained away, rather than repeated. Now, let us slow down and be honest with each other. Does any of this prove there is a lost human civilization frozen under the Antarctic ice? No, it does not come close. The ice sheet is not new. Geological evidence puts the first major glaciation of Antarctica at around 34 million years ago. The forest in that nature paper grew 90 million years ago, when the continent sat further north and dinosaurs were still walking on it. There were no humans, there was no one to build anything. Hapgood's underlying theory that the crust of the Earth periodically slips over the mantle and relocates the poles within a few thousand years has never been supported by the geological record. Albert Einstein did write a sympathetic foreword to his 1958 book, and that gets quoted constantly, but a foreword is not a proof. And the grounded version is still extraordinary. Beneath that ice sits a continent-sized landscape no one has ever walked on. A buried mountain range the size of the Alps, the Gamburtzebs, detected by a Soviet seismic team in 1958 and surveyed by air in 2008, still carrying the shape of river valleys cut before the ice arrived. 400 sealed lakes, the deepest canyon on any continent, ecosystems that may have been evolving in total darkness since before our species existed. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than of the rock under East Antarctica. That is what the wall protects. Not a secret city, something harder to accept. A second Earth with mountains, rivers, coastlines, and lakes sitting where we have been told for 2 centuries there is nothing at all. So here is the question this investigation cannot close. If a coastline can be mapped, forgotten, buried under 2 miles of ice, and then found again by radar thousands of years later, how much of the human record has already been erased the same way? Not destroyed, just covered. And now the ice is thinning. Tonight, the wall James Clark Ross found in 1841 is still standing at the edge of the Ross Sea, 50 meters of blue ice above black water, calving slabs the size of city blocks into a sea no one is allowed to drill. Beneath it, Lake Vostok is still sealed in the dark, holding water that has not touched air since before the first apes came down from the trees. The Gamburtsev valleys are still buried. The treaty still holds. The clock still runs to 2048. Everything down there was mapped, measured, and then frozen shut. And it is still waiting. If you want to know what else the ancient world charted that we were told to walk past, watch the next investigation on screen right now.